Hello again, everyone. Again, I'm Mason Tring, a senior here at Bowling Green State University, majoring in psychology and sociology. And I'm here to deliver a presentation on my project titled Salient Identities, Identity Gaps, and Identity Negotiation. As I have mentioned earlier, that is the second project that belongs to my honors project, which I conducted this past semester. The second project that I'm going to present to you in a few minutes is greatly related to the first project because both of these two projects use an intersectional approach, to studying LGBTQ plus participants. Therefore, both of them have similarities, but they also have differences. This particular project has a qualitative approach, the data would look different. The findings and like the implications would also look different. So now let's dive into this presentation. You must wonder what salient identities mean. So salient identities are defined as identities that one considered to be most important to his or her self-concept. For me, my salient identities would be um, of Vietnamese college students. So that would be my identity as Vietnamese, and my identity as a college student are considered salient to my self concept. As I have mentioned in the other presentation, intersectionality means that the intersection between two identities or more identities of a person would intersect and create a very unique experience in life for that one person. As I have been doing some research in literature, I found that communication theory of identity definitely helps my investigation of salient identities and identity gaps. And the 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 communication theory of identity focuses on identity as an interaction of different frames, or in other words, different layers of the same identity. And those frames are personal. And the personal frame means that it's like the layer about the perceptions about one's identity. And the enacted layer, which means that how one might express or present that identity to other people. The third frame is called relational. That means that how that identity is manifested or, um, you know, express or look like in certain relationships that one person has with other people. The last layer in the communication theory of identity is called the communal layer, and this denotes how a certain identity would look like or felt in a certain community or in terms of a certain sense of belonging to a certain community. Also, literature has pointed out that individuals who experiences um, dissonance in terms of their different frames of the same identity might find different ways to negotiate this certain identity of theirs. And literature has also highlighted the fact that identity gaps can cause psychological distress and relationship difficulties for the person. The main purpose of this project are stated as following. The first purpose of this project is to learn about the range of salient identities that individuals have. Um, the two salient identities that I just made as like examples earlier are just like very um, specific ways of defining salient identities to myself. And to other people, like there are various combination, um, you know of salient identities. It could be about race and age. It could be about gender and sexuality. It could be about one's educational status and one's age. Anything like that can compose a very unique combination of salient identities. Another purpose for this study is to understand how um, you know, how individuals' identity gaps or a lack thereof exists in terms of the four identity frames. The last purpose for this project is to explore varying pathways of identity negotiation. So as I have established earlier, literature has shown that identity negotiation does happen as one feels a certain identity gap, but literature has not really specified on what those pathways or what like those ways that individuals utilize to negotiate identities are. I do attempt to address that limitation in literature in this study. So for this study, I interviewed 20 participants at Bowling Green State University who had at least one LGBTQ plus identity, and they were between the age of 18 and 24. I recruited them through, campus updates, which is like a daily newsletter of Bowling Green State University. And I also posted flyers at the Office of Multicultural Affairs and the LGBTQ plus Resource Center. These interviews were confidential and they were about an hour to an hour and a half long for each. And each participant was awarded one $15 Amazon gift card as a compensation. And for the data analysis process, I used inductive thematic analysis for the interviews. And this method means that I would go through each transcript, which I personally transcribe verbatim from each recording of each participant. I would go through each transcript, identify the themes, um, and then I would sort of cluster all of these recurring themes together, put all the quotes that, point to the same theme together, and then sort of like come up with like a general definition for certain themes. So I would like to show you what the demographic breakdown looks like for this study. So in terms of ethnicity, this sample is primarily white. So 80% of the people were white. And in terms of religion, as you can see on the slide right here, the majority of them are atheists or agnostic. In terms of sexual orientation, the wide majority of them have more than just one sexual orientation. And in terms of gender identity, the majority of them identify as women. The next part that I would like to present to you is about the findings, which is the most important part of this presentation. So with the data that I have accumulated, I came up with a model that I personally think would help with how you might visualize, like the different ways that one might negotiate their identities. So first I would like to point out that as one experience an identity gap, they would choose one of the three different ways to respond to the identity gap. And these three different ways do not mean that like they would attempt to resolve the conflict or the identity gap per se, but there are merely different ways how one would go about responding firsthand to such an identity gap as they become aware of the identity gap. So the first way that they would respond is to ignore the conflict. So like they can uh, choose to neglect the conflict as they find themselves unable to cope with the conflict, or they find themselves unable to resolve the conflict. Another interesting way of responding to an identity gap is called identity compartmentalization. That is one of the most important and I would say vital piece in this model that one should take away. So, identity compartmentalization in itself is not really a way of resolving the conflict, but I would associate it with as like a stationary point. So, like, it's like a way that you would respond to the identity gap, but you're not really like getting rid of that gap. Um, I would say that. So under identity compartmentalization, there are two different sub-themes called identity concealment, identity prioritization, which I will go into more depth a little bit later. And then another way that one may go about responding to identity gap is to absolve the conflict. And to absolve the conflict is to resolve it or get rid of it, or try to at least attempt to get rid of it. So under absolution of conflict, there is identity disclosure, and then there is also conflict normalization. What follows under conflict normalization is self-advocacy and internal resolution. On the other hand, if one does not um, find any, identity gap between certain identities, the person would feel like they can, explore their identity further, or they would feel affirmed about their identity. So this should serve as an overview of what I'm going to present in depth in a couple of minutes. So I would touch base on, like a variety of different combinations of identity gaps that, the people in the sample had in terms of their two salient identities. And then I would go into more depth about identity compartmentalization. And then we're going to look at absolution of conflict. And lastly, we're going to touch base on a lack of identity gap. First, about identity gaps. Identity gaps are defined as dimensions in which two identities of an individual come in conflict. And these gaps can exist in single layers, or they can exist in multiple layers at the same times. And also be mindful of the fact that whether it be single layers or multiple layers, it can be any one of the four frames, or it can be any two or more of the four frames simultaneously. I included an example for how a single layered identity gap would look like in terms of the personal frame. So I would like to read the quote from a participant who identified as Black and gender fluid. It's definitely a hard thing as what I'm feeling very masculine. And the idea of Black men being more dangerous, sometimes that does get reflected upon me as well. And an example that I have for multi-layered identity gaps is um, of a participant who identifies as Native American and bisexual, and this identity gap exists across their personal, enacted, and communal frames of these two identities that they have. Um, so as she realizes that there is no LGBTQ plus people being out or creating their own sub-community in her tribal Native American community, she confesses. I definitely feel like I don't have as much of a space within her tribal community, to fully express myself like I would in the LGBTQ plus community. Next, I would like to go into more depth about identity compartmentalization, which is a concept that I truly think, a lot of people would find interesting and would find compelling. Um, so, identity compartmentalization is defined as the separation of two salient identities in an attempt to prevent the identity gap. Um, that is just a prevention of the identity gap. Um, you know, from coming into like a person's like self awareness or like for to like the person like consciousness. Like it doesn't mean that like the identity gap doesn't exist in other people's like perceptions, but it's just a way for them to sort of like sort through their identities and respond to the identity gap appropriately. So under identity compartmentalization, there are two different ways that you can employ to separate your true salient identities. So the first way is to conceal your identity, and this identity concealment is defined as the decision to closet or hide one or both of the salient identities. And there are different contextual factors that contribute to this decision to hide or conceal one's identity. And those factors are family, friendship, community, and personal distress. I already provided an example here about a participant who identifies as Catholic and queer, and in terms of their friendship frame. So I would like to read the quote. I was afraid that if I would talk to my queer friends about it, about me being queer, then they would not, then they would want to know like, how does it work with you being Catholic, versus if I talk to my Catholic friends. So from this quote, you can understand that there exists, like an identity gap, between their two identity being Catholic and like queer, and the person decides to, uh, conceal their like Catholic identity among their queer friends. Another way that a person can use to compartmentalize their identities is that they can prioritize which identities that seem most important to them at a given time or in a given uh, context, and different factors that can contribute to this decision to choose one identity over the other in terms of its importance in a certain context are friendships, community, romantic relationships, and personal distress. And I put another example for this, and it belongs to a participant who identifies as a sport fan and gay. And it's also of the um, and it's also of the friendship contextual factor. So I would like to read the quote. I can't be both in the same spot. I've kind of got to be apart um, to to be what I truly am. He shares that while he discusses baseball games with his sports group or friends who are also sports enthusiasts, um, he would go into length about his boy issue, quote unquote, or gay relationship problems with his gay friends. The next response that one might engage alternatively, to respond to an identity gap is absolution of conflict. And absolution of conflict is defined as an attempt to resolve one's identity gap. And there are two sub-themes that fall under absolution of conflict. And the first one is called identity disclosure, which means that one would choose to reveal a salient identity or both identities, um, you know, or in other words, they would come out to people in a particular setting where the conflict between these two identities emerge. And another sub-theme that falls under absolution of conflict is called conflict normalization. And this sub-theme refers to different actions that one takes to resolve the conflict between their two identities in terms of their own um, perceptions of these identities. I would like to contrast uh, like the next two like sub themes that fall under conflict normalization because for self advocacy, that first piece right there, it refers to a way of resolving the conflict, uh, in respect to how one would want to try and like persuade other people to think that like the identity gap doesn't exist in those people's like perceptions, then they would find that like since other people like don't have that perception of their identities being in conflict, they would not have that conflict in their own perceptions. On the other hand, the other tactic of normalizing a conflict is called internal resolution, and this tactic is more within the person's perceptions, and it doesn't rely on like you going to length trying to persuade other people to think that like your two identities are not pitted against each other. Like you're more working inside your head, like inside your own like awareness, to kind of like separate these two identities and like find peace in both, and see that like these two identities may not come in conflict at all. The last piece in the model that I would like to go into length about is called a lack of identity gap. So a lack of identity gap is defined as the harmony or a lack of conflict between two salient identities in terms of one or multi um, or like multiple different frames. In terms of a lack of identity gap in respect to one frame only, it can be of any frames, of course. I have already provided an example here of a participant who identifies as Wiccan and gender fluid. And it's going to be of their personal frame. I would like to read the quote. There isn't a conflict because Wicca is very big on the whole idea of everything is fluid. There is no really clear line between the male and female because they're two sides of the same coin. There's the female aspect, which is the goddess, and then there's the male aspect, which is the god. So it would make perfect sense that there is space in between, and that would be where I am. Also, I have put an example for, an identity, like a lack of identity gap in terms of multiple layers at the same times. And an example for that is of an experience of a person who identifies as Native American and bisexual, and like this lack of conflict in their identities pertains to their relational frame and their personal frame. And I would like to read the quote. Telling him I'm bisexual was just kind of like he took it obviously, like he obviously took it very well, because he was like, oh, I am too, and share feelings for understand each other for as well as, but also I think he helped me, or like he just helped me grow more. And then with my Native American identity, telling him about that, he was just interested, not afraid of me and my family. Because of me, he got to know me more. both in both situations, he got to know me more, and he still wants me. From these two quotes, you can see that both of these two participants reveal how they would benefit from this lack of identity gap. Both of them show that, they feel affirmed about their own identities. And as they feel like they are affirmed about their identities, there are many different avenues where they can explore these identities further because they do not encounter any challenges to expressing, living, or, building relationships based on these identities. And I would like to talk about different implications that this project has for different clinicians, social workers, and advocates of the LGBTQ plus community. So all these individuals can benefit from this project because, the different ideas such as, identity gaps between salient identities exist in a complex manner. There are various ways of identity negotiation. Identity compartmentalization is a complicated mechanism of identity negotiation. Successful internal resolution can result in identity affirmation and exploration. So all these different ideas would definitely inform these different, clinicians, social workers, advocates, you name them all, practices in general, because most of these individuals work with LGBTQ plus folks, in therapy, in self-development, or in, overcoming certain different hurdles in life. And for a lot of different LGBTQ plus folks, developing a sense of identity and nurturing that identity, um, or working to understand and accept those identities is very difficult. So understanding that, as one has, an identity as being Catholic, and that just goes against with being bisexual, for example. They must have a lot of, like distress. They must have a lot of like different like relationship issues because of these two identities, and the way that they come to accept or not accept, or develop, or conceal one of the two identities would be very complex. And from what I shared earlier, a lot of these different clinicians, social workers, advocates of or for the LGBTQ plus individuals would learn that identity development is a very complex process, and it's not just like a snap. It's just not like a switch that you just can flip on and off kind of thing. And you just have to work with the patients, like you just have to work with the people, understanding that like the process is very nuanced because certain two identities might interact in different ways, in different frames as well. um, some of the last like implications I would like to inform you about um, are about like the different limitations that this project has. So there was a lack of racial diversity in the sample, as I have mentioned in the previous presentation. Different people, especially people of color, as they have like LGBTQ plus identities. Um, they would experience life, or like they would experience like these LGBTQ plus identities in different ways than like white individuals. um, so I definitely see that a lack of racial diversity in this sample as a limitation. Also, I encountered time constraint um, during the interviewing process for this study. I felt like I was cramming, 20, um, 1 hour long to like an hour and 30 minutes long interviews into just 2 weeks. And and like at the same time, I had like a lot of assignments. I had two jobs to do. Like I had like other commitments on campus. Being like a college student and doing like all this work at the same time, definitely pressured me a lot. And I felt that had there been not for this time constraint, I would have been able to, look into the transcript, like in more depth, and maybe I would be able to like find something um, that could possibly produce more implications. Also, a lot of participants um, felt that like the process was kind of small, and like the recruitment process was kind of small as well. So I in hindsight, I would definitely try to extend that recruitment process. And in the different interviews, like some participants complained that some of the interview questions were kind of loaded, um, even though there were only like a couple of people complaining. So, as I take into account of the fact that in order for a person to talk about like their different identities, their stories, and how they come to understand their identity gaps, like the questions must be straightforward, or they must be more simplistic, or they must be more simple, in order for them to fully comprehend what we're trying to ask, or what we're trying to get. Also, there were a few participants who claimed that like they didn't really explore their identities that much prior to the study, which impacted their sharing um, of their own identities, or their own knowledge of their identity, or their own understanding of their identities at the interviews. Um, so definitely, I would recommend future researchers attempting to address these different limitations, and replicate this study and see uh, if there would be any differences, or would there be any similarities as well. Lastly, I would like to highlight the fact that more research should be done on identity compartmentalization, in order to understand the implications of the concept of intersectionality further. As I um, analyzed the data, I found that there was um, an overwhelming amount of data for identity compartmentalization, and then it was super hard to code for, and like from the different responses that I read, um, they were like very nuanced as well, which totally um, matches with my expectations, because like identities are very complex for everybody. So definitely like the way that you would want to like separate your identities, like whether you want to like conceal one, or you want to like choose one over the other in certain contexts, like those different tactics, like those different ways have to be also complex. um, so that was my presentation on salient identities, identity gaps, and identity negotiation. So I definitely thank you for your time again, for paying attention, for listening to this presentation, and yeah, I do hope to receive some good feedback so I can improve on future projects. Um, Although, pre-recording this presentation doesn't allow me to answer any of your questions, I think I do foresee one question that you all may uh, feel compelled to ask. And I think the question would be, if I had been given like an opportunity to do this all over again, then what would I do differently? Then I would the first thing is that I would dedicate more time to this, because given the time constraint, that was like a lot for me, I would say. Like interviewing 20 people back to back, 1 hour to like an hour and a half each within 2 weeks, like that was like a lot. Also, second thing is that I would, you know, uh, recruit more people to like transcribe and also like code the data with me, because I feel like, um, when you're like coding like qualitative data, you would want to have like more than just one perspectives examining the data, um, because I feel like, and like this just comes from my personal opinions, but I think that having only one perspective examining the data could result in like biases, or like you would tend to sort of like overlook things that actually matter, or like certain biases of yours kind of like factor in like your work, especially qualitative work, in terms of like interpretation and that kind of stuff. So I would definitely, have more people being on board with me for the project, and then sort of like keeping each other like in check and balances, or keeping it neutral in terms of the data analysis and everything. Um, so yeah, so again, I do thank you for um, listening to this presentation. Thank you for sparing your time. So yeah, thank you.